German sedan was a trespasser of chrome and steel on a road of earth and stone.
Its black paint, meticulously polished in the city, was now veiled in a fine layer of dust from the mile-long drive. It crept up the path, a predator uncertain of its prey. From the porch, she watched it approach, her hands stained with the soil she called her own. After 9 years of deliberate, deafening silence, they had finally come. They believed they were here for a negotiation, for a solution. But this was never going to be a negotiation. It was a reckoning. They just hadn't realized, not yet, that it was entirely theirs. This is a story about the deep, quiet difference between profit and what makes a real legacy. It's about the long road back to a truth they tried to bury. If you've ever had to choose your own path against the wishes of everyone who was supposed to support you, you'll want to see precisely how this ends. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moment they realize their mistake. Hurt. Rejected. Let me know in the comments, have you ever had to fight for a dream that no one else understood? To see where it all began, we have to go back 9 years. To a dinner table, in a room as cold and polished as their ambition. The world was a different place. It was smaller, enclosed by glass walls 30 stories above the city. The dining table was a slab of polished black marble, reflecting the cold, recessed lighting from above. There was no clutter, no warmth, just the clean, unforgiving lines of a life lived on display. The air itself smelled of nothing at all, a carefully engineered absence of scent. Clara sat opposite them, a younger version of herself, constrained by a silk blouse and a business suit that felt like a costume. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor, were not so much sitting as they were presiding. Their movements were precise, their smiles were strategic. They spoke of her future as if it were a quarterly report to be finalized. First, the MBA from Wharton. Then, a fast-tracked promotion to VP of Acquisitions at Sterling Foods. It was a path paved with gold, leading to a throne she never wanted. She let the silence settle after their presentation. Then, her voice, small but steady in the cavernous room, delivered her own plan. She was leaving her job. She was taking the inheritance her grandparents left her, every last cent, and buying a piece of land. A farm. The words hung in the sterile air, an impurity they couldn't scrub away. Her mother's smile froze. Her father's expression? It didn't just change, it broke. He looked at her, not as a daughter, but as a catastrophic miscalculation. Her father scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the silence. This family builds empires, Clara, not mud pies. His voice was cold, laced with a profound disappointment. We create value you can see on a balance sheet. Something tangible. But as he spoke, another voice surfaced in her memory, softer and far more real. Her grandfather, years ago, showing her a tiny sapling in his garden. Never forget, he'd told her, his own hands dusted with soil. The best things grow slowly. A real legacy isn't what you take from the world. It's what you put back into the earth. At that dinner table, his words were just a
ghost. But soon, they would become a blueprint for her entire life, a truth she was about to discover with her own two hands.
The land she bought was neglected, a tangle of overgrown fields and a leaning fence line that had long since given up.
But when Clara stepped out of her beat-up truck, she saw what her grandfather had taught her to see.
She walked past the brambles and knelt, plunging her hands deep into the soil. It was dark, rich, and alive. She let the cool earth run through her fingers, breathing in the deep, loamy scent of life and decay. This was not a transaction. This was a homecoming. Her father spoke of value on a balance sheet, of numbers in a column that could be added or erased. But this was different. This was a value you could hold. It was a silent promise between her and the land, a legacy measured not in dollars, but in seasons. She had found her place in the world, but to truly claim it, she first had to walk away from the one she was born into, forever. The final conversation wasn't a shouting match. It was colder than that. It was a severance negotiation where only one side had terms. Her father stood by the door to their apartment, his posture as unyielding as the polished marble floor. "If you walk out that door, Clara," he said, his voice flat, "you are no longer a part of this family or its future. We will not support this delusion." Her mother didn't look at her. She sat perfectly still, a portrait of calculated disappointment, her hands folded in her lap. Her silence was a verdict, more damning than any angry word. She was already editing Clara out of the family story. Across the room, her younger sister Maya looked on, trapped between allegiance and fear. Clara saw it all then, her father's ultimatum, her mother's silent judgment, her sister's terrified compliance. It was a life sentence of quiet approval-seeking. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out. The heavy apartment door clicked shut behind her, a quiet, definitive sound. That click echoed the closing of a ledger. The emotional debt was settled. The legal paperwork, she would soon discover, was already being drawn up. The first months on the farm were a blur of aching muscles and dwindling savings. The dream felt fragile, held together by sheer will. Then the official letter arrived. It was from the family's law firm, the same one that handled their corporate mergers. The first part was expected, a formal notice disavowing any future claims on the family estate. A clean cut. But the second part was a different kind of violence, a demand that she immediately cease using the Sterling family name in any professional capacity. They weren't just closing a door, they were trying to board it up from the outside. They wanted to make sure her little delusion could never be associated with their pristine empire. It was a cold, legal severing, designed not just to disown her, but to erase her. But in their attempt to sever her from the family's legacy, they accidentally gave her the very reason to start digging through its true history. To escape the coldness of the legal notice, she sought warmth in the past. In the attic of the old farmhouse were dusty boxes her grandparents had left behind. Inside one, beneath faded photographs, she found them, a set of leather-bound journals. Her grandfather's handwriting, a strong, steady script, filled every page. He wrote of his original vision for Sterling Foods, a company built on partnerships with farmers, on ingredients you could trust. But then, the entries grew troubled. He wrote of her father's ambition, his obsession with marketing over substance. She found the exact passage that stopped her breath. He is building a house of cards on a foundation of clever marketing, not good soil. It cannot last. She read the words again. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. And she was about to witness the funeral for the very soul of the company he'd created. That funeral for the company's soul came not with flowers, but with a news alert. A major product recall for Sterling Foods.
Clara read the details online, a cold sickness settling in her stomach. Contamination. The cause? Cheap, imported ingredients, a direct violation of every principle her grandfather had ever written down. That evening, she saw her father on television. He was the picture of corporate stability, his suit perfect, his expression untroubled. He looked straight into the camera and dismissed the entire incident as a minor supply chain disruption. The lie was so clean, so effortless. She was watching the man who had called her dream a delusion lie to millions without a flicker of shame. In that quiet moment, the full realization hit her. The company wasn't just in trouble, it was a ghost, a hollowed-out brand wearing her family's name. She needed to know how bad it really was, from the one person still inside that collapsing house of cards. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over her sister's name. The line connected, but Maya's voice was a ghost. She spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences, the fear of being overheard crackling through the phone. Yes, the recall was bad, she confirmed, but it was just a symptom of a much deeper disease. The company was drowning, leveraged to the absolute breaking point after a series of reckless acquisitions had failed. They were cutting corners everywhere, replacing quality with cost-saving chemicals, hollowing out the very foundations her grandfather had built. "They're looking for a silver bullet, Clara," Maya whispered, her voice strained with an urgency that terrified Clara. "A single, massive payday to make all the debt go away. Please, just be careful. Dad and Uncle Robert, they're not just ambitious anymore. They are desperate." The call ended, leaving a chilling silence. Clara didn't know what form that silver bullet would take or where it would be aimed. But across town, in a boardroom that smelled of leather and quiet panic, her father and uncle believed they had found it. In the sterile air of the Sterling Foods boardroom, the panic had finally broken. Her father and uncle clinked whiskey glasses, their faces flushed with a desperate, triumphant relief. They had found their silver bullet, a partnership with a powerful land developer, Apex Holdings. They spoke of it as a lifeline, a brilliant strategic move that would solve everything. But it was clear from their hushed, predatory excitement that they weren't saving the company. They were selling its bones to pay off their sins. Their relief was the hollow celebration of men who had found an escape hatch from the consequences of their own making. While they toasted the death of a legacy, Clara began the quiet, patient work of building a new one from the ground up. The next few years weren't a single event, but 1,000 small ones written in dirt and sweat. They were the sting of frost on an April morning and the deep ache in her back after a day of turning soil. They were failed crops that withered on the vine and long nights spent staring at ledgers that showed more red than black. This was the quiet reality of her rebellion. But then came the small victories. The first perfect harvest of heirloom tomatoes, their color deep and true. The first customer at the farmer's market who came back the next week and the week after. The first local chef who tasted her carrots and declared he would buy nothing else. Slowly, patiently, Green Acre Harvest became a name whispered with respect. Her rebellion wasn't fought in a boardroom. It was won in the soil with calloused hands. It was the quiet, persistent, undeniable act of growth. And after all those seasons of building, of proving her grandfather's wisdom right, she found herself one evening seeking his guidance again. She returned to his journals, not for a warning about the past, but for a deeper understanding of the ground beneath her feet. This time, reading as a farmer, her eyes scanned past the corporate warnings, searching for notes on soil, on seasons, on the quiet language of the land. And then she found it, tucked in the back pages, a detailed entry with a hand-drawn map. It was a survey of a parcel of land from 15 years prior. Her parcel of land. Her breath caught. Her grandfather had walked the same ground. He'd meticulously noted its unique deep water rights and a protected agricultural zoning status he called a fortress. In his steady script, he had written, "The single most valuable piece of agricultural land in this county, the key to an honest future for the company." He had tried to buy it, but the old owner refused to sell. The realization was staggering.
She hadn't chosen this place by chance. She had been led here. It was a quiet inheritance of wisdom, a path laid out for her long ago. A name was scribbled in the margin, next to the survey data. David Chen, Strategic Growth. She stared at the name, a ghost from a past she barely knew, wondering what else he might know. She didn't have to search for the name from the journal. 2 days later, as if summoned by her discovery, her phone rang. The number was blocked, but she answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and carried the weight of history. "My name is David Chen. I worked alongside your grandfather for nearly 2 decades. He explained that her father had forced his retirement shortly after taking over. For years, he'd watched from the sidelines as the company was dismantled from within. But he'd also been watching her. He'd seen the rise of Greenacre Harvest, recognizing the same quiet integrity her grandfather possessed. "You've built something real," he said, his voice filled with a respect she hadn't heard in years. "Which is why I'm calling." His true legacy deserves a fighting chance, and the truth is, time is running out. The quiet urgency in his voice was unmistakable. He had been waiting for the right moment. The moment was now. He had a way to fight back. He just needed to show her the plan. Over a secure video call, David laid out the anatomy of the collapse. It wasn't a single mistake, it was a decade of them. The acquisitions her father and uncle had celebrated were catastrophic failures, purchased with debt that had become a slow-acting poison. To hide the truth from the board and the shareholders, they hadn't just bent the rules, they had systematically broken them, cooking the books to create the illusion of a healthy company. But the illusion was finally shattering. The company wasn't just failing, it was a ghost, an empty shell on the verge of total collapse. The deal with Apex Holdings wasn't the strategic partnership they'd announced. It was a desperate fire sale. Apex wasn't buying a company. They were vultures picking over a carcass, acquiring Sterling Foods' tangible assets for pennies on the dollar to cover the massive debts before the regulators discovered the fraud. Clara listened, and the full picture finally came into focus. This wasn't about ambition anymore. It was about survival. Her family was facing not just bankruptcy, but the very real possibility of prosecution. Their desperation was a gaping wound, and as David explained the fine print of the deal, he revealed one last detail. The entire fire sale, the key to their escape, hinged on the acquisition of one final critical asset. A piece of land they had to deliver to Apex at any cost? The call from Maya came just after dusk, a frantic whisper cutting through the quiet evening. She had been walking past their father's home office and had overheard a conference call. Her father, her uncle, and the lawyers from Apex Holdings. The tone was triumphant, predatory. They weren't just talking about buying Sterling Foods. They were talking about land. An entire valley to be cleared and repurposed for a massive luxury housing development. Apex had been buying up parcels for years, quietly, patiently. And now they were at the finish line. There was only one property left. One holdout, preventing the entire multi-billion-dollar deal from closing. Clara's farm. "They have a plan," Maya choked out, her voice breaking. "A loophole. Something about eminent domain for economic revitalization? They're going to argue that your farm is underutilized land holding back progress for the whole region." Then came the final, brutal confirmation. Maya had heard their uncle laugh. "She's a sentimental hobbyist playing in the dirt," he'd said to the lawyers. "She won't even see the legal paperwork coming until the bulldozers are on her lawn." In that moment, the vague threat David had warned her about took on a sharp, terrifying form. They weren't just trying to save their company. They were prepared to annihilate her world to do it. The shock lasted only a moment, quickly burning away to reveal something hard and cold beneath it. The universe is really just... It's silent. They had just confirmed the battlefield. It was time to draw up a plan of attack. Clara met David in a small, quiet coffee shop miles from her farm.
The air smelled of roasted beans, a stark contrast to the scent of impending corporate warfare. This couldn't be a simple defensive fight. David made that clear. A legal battle over zoning could drag on for years, bleeding her dry. They needed leverage. They needed a pincer movement. The plan they devised was brutally simple and fought on two fronts. The first front was business. David would use his inside knowledge, combined with the devastating entries from her grandfather's journals, to create a package for the independent members of the Sterling Foods Board. It would be a quiet, digital bomb, exposing the years of financial rot and proving the Apex deal was an act of fraud, not strategy. The second front was the land itself. Clara had recently used her grandfather's notes to successfully petition for the farm to receive a historical landmark designation, protecting it from developers. While her family schemed to rezone her land, she had already turned it into a legal fortress. The plan was a quiet, ticking clock set to detonate at the precise moment of their greatest arrogance. And across town, completely unaware of the fuse that had just been lit, her father and uncle were already pouring the champagne. In a private dining room downtown, the celebration was already underway. The finest wine, the most expensive cuts of meat. A feast for men who believed they had already won. Her father and uncle raised their glasses to the Apex executives, toasting a future built on leveled ground and luxury condos. They spoke of her farm not as a home, but as a final parcel, an administrative hurdle. Her Uncle Robert laughed, a sound slick with confidence. "She's stubborn," he confided to the table. "A bit of a romantic. But she'll see reason. Family, after all, always comes first." The lie was a ghost at their table, listening to them toast their own demise. They saw her as an emotional problem to be managed, a sentimental obstacle standing in the way of their salvation. In their blind confidence, they've forgotten that she is not just a farmer standing in their way. She is her grandfather's living legacy. If you are finding value in this story of quiet resilience, take a moment to like the video. It helps us share more stories of strength just like this one. Let's discuss below. What do you believe is more powerful in the end? A corporate empire built on convenient lies, or a single seed of truth planted in good soil? Because when the pressure of business and law isn't enough, desperation always turns to a more personal weapon. The first move in this new phase wouldn't come from a lawyer, but from the one voice she hadn't heard in years. The call came the morning before they were scheduled to arrive. The name on the screen was a ghost. "Mother?" Clara answered, and the voice on the other end was not the one she remembered from that last cold conversation. It was soft, almost syrupy, a carefully practiced tone of gentle reason. "Clara, I know it's been a long time," her mother began, the words smooth and polished. "I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling because your father, he's been under an immense amount of pressure. He carries the weight of this family, of the company your grandfather built." She paused, letting the silence work its poison. This one thing you could do for him, for all of us, selling the land to Apex, it would heal so much. It would be a way for you to finally come back to the family, to show that you understand what legacy truly means. It was a perfect performance. She was framing their demand not as an attack, but as a chance for Clara's redemption. The request was wrapped in the language of forgiveness, a guilt-laced invitation to sacrifice her entire world on the altar of their convenience. The call ended, leaving a sticky residue of false sentiment in the air. It was an act designed to weaken her resolve just before the final attack. But another message was already on its way. A quiet whisper of truth meant to cut through all the noise. Just moments after her mother's hollow performance ended, Clara's phone lit up again. It was a text from Maya, short and urgent. "They're on their way!" Don't believe the act. Remember Grandpa's journals. It was a quiet anchor in a storm of manipulation. A small, dangerous act of loyalty from the sister trapped on the other side. In that single message, Clara's resolve hardened into something absolute. She realized she wasn't just fighting against them anymore. She was fighting for what was left of the truth. This is for Maya, for the legacy her grandfather had tried to protect. She braced herself for their arrival, knowing they would come wearing masks. Her mother had already played her part. Now, her father and uncle would try theirs, beginning with the crudest and most insulting performance of all. Her father's practice speech about family unity had failed. Her mother's silent, wounded performance had earned nothing. So her uncle, Robert, the family's closer, decided it was time to deploy the only tool he truly believed in: money. He stepped away from the others, pulling her aside with a gesture that was meant to feel like an intimate confidence. "Look, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's cut through all the sentimental nonsense. This has been a charming little project, and you should be proud. But it's time to be a grown-up." He named a number, a figure with enough zeros to buy a life of ease, a figure he was certain would shock the simple farmer back into her senses. "There," he said, a smug, predatory smile playing on his lips. "A clean slate. Everything has a price tag. Just name yours." But his fatal mistake was assuming her life's work was for sale. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. Her voice was quiet, but it landed with surgical precision. "That's a generous offer, Robert. But tell me, is that my price? Or is that just what's left after you cover the fraudulent loan you took out to guarantee the Apex deal?" The smile evaporated from his face. The confident dealmaker vanished, replaced by a man who had just seen a ghost. And seeing that raw panic in his eyes, her mind flashed back to an hour before, to the quiet moments on her porch as she watched the dust cloud of their arrival on the horizon, preparing for this very reckoning. The dust from their approaching car settled on the porch railings, a fine coat of city grime on country wood. This was the moment from the cold open, the scene she had played in her mind 1,000 times. There they were, stepping out of the car, looking smaller and more out of place than she remembered. Her father, his shoulders tight beneath his expensive suit. Her mother, her posture a rigid shield against the wildness of the landscape. And her uncle, already scanning the property, not with wonder, but with the cold appraisal of an auctioneer. For a moment, all the anger she'd felt over the years simply vanished, replaced by a deep, quiet ache of sadness. This was what they had chosen. This hollow performance of family unity, this desperate grab for a lifeline, was the final product of the empire they'd built. They had traded every piece of her grandfather's legacy for this single panicked moment on her gravel driveway. She thought of the 9 years of silence, the loneliness of the first winter, the joy of the first sprout pushing through the soil, the quiet pride of building something real, season by season, with her own 2 hands. She was not the same girl who had walked out of their sterile dining room. That girl was gone, burned away by the sun and hardened by the frost. The woman standing on this porch now was the owner of this land, the master of her own life. A quiet, unshakable strength settled over her. The reckoning was here, just as she had planned. The action that sealed their fate didn't happen on a porch in the bright light of day. It happened the night before, in the quiet darkness. It was a purely digital execution, precise and irreversible. While the crickets sang outside her window, Clara was on a secure line with David. He had the access, the credentials, the list of the independent board members who still valued her grandfather's legacy over her father's hollow ambition. With a final confirmation from Clara, David assembled the package. It wasn't just data. It was a carefully constructed narrative of decay. Scans of her grandfather's most damning journal entries. A forensic accountant's breakdown of the company's true, staggering debt. And finally, the undeniable proof of the fraudulent accounting, the digital breadcrumbs they thought they had erased. He attached the file. The subject line was simple. Regarding the future of Sterling Foods. The email was sent. A quiet, digital bomb delivered to the inboxes of the only people who could stop the Apex deal. The fuse was lit. The countdown started. While her family slept, believing their power was absolute, the foundations of their empire were being dissolved by the truth. And as they drove toward her farm the next morning, confident in their strategy, they had no idea they were marching toward a battle that had already been lost. Inside the dust-covered sedan, Richard Sterling was finalizing his own attack. On the phone with the family's top litigator, his voice was calm, confident, the sound of a man who had never truly lost. He confirmed the strategy one last time. File the petition with the County Planning Commission by 5 p.m. The legal argument was a masterpiece of corporate aggression, citing an obscure eminent domain clause for regional economic revitalization. It would paint Clara's farm as a sentimental obstruction to progress, a low-yield hobby holding back thousands of jobs. "We can't afford any delays," Richard instructed, his voice firm. The penalty clause in the Apex contract is brutal. It would wipe out what little is left if this deal fails. He saw his daughter, not as family, but as the final variable in a complex equation he was about to solve with overwhelming force. He believed he was a patriarch saving his legacy, and she was merely the last sentimental hurdle to be cleared. He ended the call just as the sedan turned onto the long gravel driveway, the farmhouse coming into view. The battle, in his mind, was already won. All that remained was the performance of her surrender. He had no way of knowing he was merely a guest, arriving at a confrontation that had already been arranged for him, on a stage that was not his own. She didn't invite them into her home. The house was a private space, filled with 9 years of a life they had no part in. Instead, she met them on the wide wooden porch. It was her territory, the threshold between her world and theirs. She had set up a small, weathered table with a pitcher of water and 3 simple glasses. No coffee, no tea, just water. It was a gesture of basic hospitality and nothing more. A quiet, clear statement that this was not a social call. The cultural chasm between them was palpable in that small detail. Her father, Richard, took the seat she had indicated, his movements stiff, attempting to project an authority he did not possess here. He surveyed the scene, not with appreciation, but as if assessing an underperforming asset. He cleared his throat, launching into a speech he had clearly rehearsed. It was a performance of the benevolent patriarch, a man willing to forgive a youthful mistake. He spoke of second chances, of family unity, of bringing her charming little project back into the fold where it belonged. He painted a picture of a glorious future, her farm supercharged by Sterling Foods resources, and her given a respectable position within the company. He presented it not as a demand, but as a gift. A magnificent act of benevolence. He finished, a magnanimous smile fixed on his face, letting his generous offer hang in the air between them. He expected gratitude. He expected negotiation. He expected, above all, to be in control. He waited for her reply, completely unaware that his entire performance was about to be dismantled by a single, quiet word. Clara let his words hang in the air. She didn't react with anger or with triumph. She simply watched him, her expression patient, as if listening to a salesman make a pitch for something she would never buy. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass at the edge of the field. Her movement was slow, deliberate. She reached for the glass of water in front of her, her fingers closing around it. She took a sip. The small, quiet sound seemed to echo in the sudden tension. She placed the glass back on the table with a soft click, a sound of finality. Then she met her father's expectant gaze. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried across the porch with absolute, unshakable clarity. No. The word landed in the space between them, not as a rejection, but as a verdict. Her father's benevolent smile froze, then cracked. He stared at her, speechless. He had come here to absorb her world into his. He had not considered, even for a moment, that she would refuse to be conquered. The public humiliation was a blow he couldn't absorb. And when his performance failed, he did what he always did. He tried to move the fight behind a closed door where he thought the real power lay. Her father's voice was a choked whisper. No? The word was an impossibility, a crack in the foundation of his world. The mask of the patriarch fell away, revealing the raw, entitled rage beneath. After everything this family gave you, the name, the education, the opportunities you threw away, you stand here on this hobby, and you dare to say no to me? His anger was a storm, but Clara was the calm at its center. Her voice remained level, each word a carefully placed stone. You're not here to buy my farm. You're here to sell it. You need this parcel to finalize your deal with Apex Holdings. She paused, letting the name land. A deal that is nothing more than a desperate fire sale to cover the fraud that has hollowed Sterling Foods out from the inside. Her Uncle Robert opened his mouth to object, a denial forming on his lips, but Clara looked directly at him. As Grandpa wrote in his journal in 2011, Robert's ambition is a ship without a rudder. It mistakes motion for progress and will one day run the entire company aground. The color drained from both their faces at once. It was a perfect, synchronized moment of horror. It wasn't just that she knew about Apex. She had the proof. She had the timeline. She had their own father's words, a ghost at the table condemning them. They realized in that shared, silent panic that they had lost long before they ever arrived. The reckoning wasn't coming. It was here. And she was about to deliver the terms of their surrender. She let the silence on the porch stretch, giving their shock enough space to curdle into raw fear. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not triumphant. It was the calm, steady voice of consequence. You will call Apex Holdings and you will cancel the deal. You will then call an emergency meeting of the board. At that meeting, you and Uncle Robert will tender your resignations, effective immediately. She let the words hang in the heavy air, allowing them to understand that these were not suggestions. In exchange, she continued, her gaze unwavering, the evidence I have will be presented to the board, and only to the board. It will not be sent to the SEC. It'll be enough to end your careers, but it may spare you from prison. And after you are gone, I will present a plan to save this company. A real plan, built on my grandfather's principles. She stood then, a clear, unspoken dismissal. The choice was theirs. They could cling to the crumbling facade of their pride, or they could salvage what little remained of their freedom. She left them sitting in the fading light, the architects of their own ruin, with a single night to decide which pieces to save from the wreckage. They drove away in a cloud of dust and stunned silence. The game was already over. They just hadn't accepted it yet. The next morning broke clear and cold. Clara was where she always was at dawn, in her fields, her hands in the earth. The rhythm of her work was a quiet meditation, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting miles away in the city. Her phone vibrated against her hip. A text from David. It was just 3 words. Meeting has started. A few minutes later, he called. His voice was steady, but she could hear the undercurrent of victory. They're panicking, he confirmed. They have no idea how deep the evidence goes. They walked in expecting to control the narrative. Clara looked out at the rows of green, a quiet testament to slow, steady growth. The fight was happening in a sterile boardroom, but the war had been won right here, in the soil. Now she would get to hear exactly how it all fell apart. David's voice over the phone was the calm chronicle of a collapse. He described the boardroom, the tension thick and suffocating as her father began to speak. They tried to frame it as a rescue mission. They painted Clara as a sentimental obstacle, a daughter whose emotional attachment was jeopardizing the legacy her grandfather built. They presented the Apex deal not as a fire sale, but as a painful but necessary choice to save hundreds of jobs. For a few moments, David said, the spin was working. Then, the package he'd sent was projected onto the main screen. The journals, the fraudulent reports, the entire decade of decay laid bare for the board to see. David described the silence that followed. It was absolute. The independent directors looked from the screen to her father to her uncle, and the deference in their eyes was replaced by cold fury. They saw the lie for what it was, not a strategy, but a desperate cover-up. Her father tried to object, but his authority had evaporated. Her uncle, Robert, simply stared at the screen, his face pale. The questions from the board were not inquiries, they were accusations. Faced with the certainty of shareholder lawsuits and a federal investigation, the choice was made for them. An hour later, an internal memo announced their immediate and unexpected retirements. The final piece of news David delivered was the one that sealed the reversal. The board, desperate for a leader with integrity and a plan that wasn't built on lies, had voted unanimously. They were offering Clara the position of interim CEO with a mandate to oversee a complete restructuring of the company. The corporate verdict had been delivered. The official story was written, but the personal reckoning, she knew, was only a phone call away. The call came that evening. His name appeared on her screen, and she knew this was the final thread of their old life, a thread that had to be cut. She answered. His voice was a ruin. The polished, commanding tone of the patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow, rasping bitterness. There was no apology. There was no understanding. There was only the raw, wounded pride of a fallen king. "You destroyed it," he whispered, the words ragged with disbelief. "Everything. My entire life's work. You burned it to the ground in a single day just to prove a point." Clara stood by her kitchen window, looking out at the fields as they settled into the quiet of dusk. Her voice when she spoke was not cruel. It was simply a statement of fact, a correction to a history he had miswritten for decades. "It was never your life's work," she said calmly. "It was Grandpa's. You were just its caretaker, and you let it starve." He started to object, to rage, but she delivered the final, clean truth. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm saving what he built. You were just squatting in the ruins." She ended the call. The silence that followed was absolute, the severing of a bond that had been toxic for years. The personal war was over. But she knew that by killing the Apex deal, she hadn't vanquished the enemy, she'd only changed its name. A desperate family was one thing. A multi-billion-dollar developer that had just been publicly humiliated was something else entirely. They wouldn't come with family baggage and manipulative pleas. They would come with an army of lawyers, and their war would be fought on paper, not on a porch. Apex Holdings didn't waste time with sentiment. Their response was not a phone call, but a federal lawsuit that landed with the force of a physical blow. Breach of contract, tortious interference. The language was cold, brutal, and backed by a legal team that billed more in an hour than the farm made in an entire season. Simultaneously, a different kind of war began. A slick public relations campaign, funded by Apex, started appearing in local papers and online forums. Suddenly, Greenacre Harvest wasn't a local success story. It was a low-yield obstruction to progress. They cast her as the villain in a story of their own making, the sentimental hobbyist standing in the way of jobs and prosperity for the entire county. They thought they were fighting a farmer. They saw an idealist, someone who would be easily intimidated by corporate power and suffocated by legal jargon. Their strategy was simple. Bury her in paperwork, bleed her dry with legal fees, and poison public opinion against her until she had no choice but to sell. It was the classic playbook of a predator cornering its prey. But in their haste to sue, they had made a fatal error. The lawsuit forced Clara, in her new capacity as CEO of Sterling Foods, to conduct a full and formal due diligence on the very deal they were suing over. They had just given her the legal mandate to uncover the truth. They thought they were starting a war, but they had just handed her the key to discovering the real crime. The due diligence process was a slow, methodical excavation of financial records. Clara's new legal team wasn't searching for a crime, they were simply building a defense against the lawsuit. But then they found it. Buried in a subclause of a financing agreement was a secret, unauthorized bridge loan signed personally by her uncle, Robert. He had leveraged millions of dollars against company assets to cover his own catastrophic investment losses. The loan's repayment wasn't just expected from the Apex deal, it was the deal's personal guarantee. If the acquisition collapsed, he would default, and his crime would be exposed. This wasn't just desperation, it was felony bank fraud. The final, hidden piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was the leverage she needed, a weapon far more powerful than any zoning dispute. With the evidence in hand, there was only one person left to confront. She met him in a sterile conference room, a place that felt more like his world than hers. She didn't speak of betrayal or anger. She simply slid a single document across the polished table, the fraudulent loan agreement, with her uncle's signature stark against the white page. Her father stared at it, his face losing what little color it had left. "Apex didn't just want my land," Clara said, her voice quiet but absolute. "They needed it as collateral to secure Robert's personal debt. He gambled the entire company to save himself. That's not a bad business deal. That's a federal crime." For the first time, she saw true defeat in his eyes. Not anger, not defiance, but the hollowed-out look of a man watching the last wall of his fortress crumble to dust. "He told me it was the only way," he whispered. a confession to the empty room. The only way to stop the bleeding. Clara gave him no comfort, only a choice. You will cooperate fully in unwinding this deal. You will testify against Apex's predatory practices. If you do, the company will not press charges against Robert. We will leave him to the authorities. He slumped in his chair, a king with no kingdom left. He slowly nodded. It was a complete and total surrender. The empire was gone. All that remained was to assign the blame. And for that, there was only one person left for him to face. The call came from Maya later that day. Her voice was a strained whisper, holding the phone away from her mouth as if afraid it might burn her. Through the receiver, Clara could hear them. The shouting was raw, stripped of all its corporate polish. It was the sound of two cornered animals turning on each other. "You sold me out," Robert's voice snarled, laced with a venomous disbelief. "To save yourself, you threw your own brother to the wolves." Her father's reply was no longer the voice of a defeated man. It was sharp, brittle, and desperate to assign blame. "You did this, Robert, not me. You signed that loan. You bet the entire company on a bluff, and you lost. This is the consequence of your greed, not my betrayal." The argument devolved from there, a bitter unpacking of decades of resentment and jealousy. It was never a partnership. It had always been a rivalry, a toxic alliance, held together only by profit. "Grandpa was right about you," Richard finally spat, the words a final killing blow. "He said your ambition would be the death of this company. I should have listened." The line went quiet for a moment before Maya came back on, her voice trembling. "They're done," she whispered. "It's over." The rot had finally eaten through the center beam of their empire. And with that final, internal crack, the whole corrupt structure began to fall. With the family alliance shattered, the consequences arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet, methodical turning of legal gears. The first domino to fall was the largest. Faced with a countersuit from Sterling Foods, armed with undeniable proof of fraud, and with the shadow of a federal investigation looming, Apex Holdings quietly withdrew its lawsuit. Their grand vision for the valley evaporated overnight, a multi-billion-dollar dream dissolved by a truth they had underestimated. The second domino was personal. Stripped of his brother's protection and facing a mountain of evidence, Uncle Robert pleaded guilty to felony bank fraud. His sentence was a quiet headline in the business section, a brief paragraph that served as the final, sterile epitaph for a career built on reckless ambition. He traded his boardroom for a federal penitentiary. But destruction was never Clara's goal. Her focus was on restoration. As interim CEO, her first act was to rename the company. Sterling Foods, a name now synonymous with scandal, became Sterling Provisions, a quiet promise of a new direction. The old supply chains, built on cheap imports and chemical shortcuts, were dismantled. In their place, she forged partnerships with small local farms, many of them just like her own. New lines of organic, traceable products began to fill the development pipeline. She was piece by piece rebuilding the company her grandfather had envisioned, fulfilling the legacy her father had abandoned. But she knew a true transformation wasn't just about changing product labels.
It was about changing the very soul of the company. A legacy, she had learned, is not what you take, but what you build. Her first major act as CEO wouldn't be a strategic acquisition or a cost-cutting measure. It would be a quiet, radical reinvestment in the people the old company had treated as disposable, beginning with a final gift intended to rewrite her sister's future. Clara turned down the 7-figure salary that came with the CEO title. The money, she argued to the board, wasn't hers by right. It belonged to the company's future. In her first official act, she established the Sterling Provisions Education Fund, a scholarship program for employees and their families to pursue any education they chose, not just the prescribed MBA her father had demanded of her. It was a direct repudiation of his narrow, transactional vision of success. And she put Maya in charge of it all. It wasn't just a job, it was an escape route. A chance for her sister to finally find her own path, far from the shadow of the corporate ladder they had both been forced to climb. The profits that had once fueled greed were now planting seeds of a different kind. She had rebuilt the company's future. Now, she had to address the ghosts of her own past, starting with the 2 people waiting for a return to a normal that no longer existed. A few months later, she agreed to see them. They met on neutral ground, in the living room of the smaller, tastefully anonymous house they now lived in. It was a space defined not by what it had, but by what it had lost. The scale, the cold grandeur, the sense of absolute authority. Her mother poured tea with hands that were steady, but her eyes kept searching Clara's face for a sign, for a crack in her composure that would let the old dynamic rush back in. Her father tried to speak of the future, of the company's recovering stock price, as if they were colleagues discussing a successful project. They were attempting to build a bridge back to a past that Clara had already burned behind her. They were hoping for a return to a familiar, comfortable silence, where what was broken could simply be ignored. Clara let them finish. She didn't correct their narrative or relitigate the past. She simply established the terms of the new world they all now inhabited. "We can have a relationship," she said, her voice calm and clear, without a trace of anger. "But it will not be the one we had before. It will be an honest one, or it will be nothing at all. The performances are over. The strategic silences, the convenient truths, all of it. That life is finished." There was no dramatic scene of forgiveness, no tearful embrace. There was only the quiet, profound realization that the old family was gone forever. What stood in its place was something new, something fragile, with clearly marked boundaries. It was a foundation built not on obligation, but on a choice to be honest or to be strangers. The hard work of untangling the past was finally done. Now she could turn her attention to the one relationship that had survived the wreckage, the one that felt not like a negotiation, but like coming home. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the fields as she walked with Maya between rows of thriving kale. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the promise of a coming frost. It was a quietness that was earned, a peace that had been fought for. They didn't speak of the past, of the boardrooms or the bitter phone calls. That world felt a million miles away. Maya stopped and looked at her sister,
her eyes clear for the first time in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Not just for the fund. Thank you for showing me there was another way to live. I was so lost in their world, I forgot you could draw your own map." Clara smiled, a real, unguarded smile. She reached down and broke a crisp leaf from a nearby plant, handing it to her sister. It was a simple offering, a piece of the life she had built. In that moment, they weren't the heirs to a broken empire or the daughters of fallen parents. They were just two sisters, standing in a field with a future that was finally their own. Clara looked out over her land, the setting sun turning the edges of the leaves to gold. This place, this soil, had been her refuge, her battlefield, and now her victory. It had demanded everything from her, and in return, it had given her back to herself. A legacy isn't something you inherit in a boardroom. It's something you build, seed by seed, season by season. It's the quiet, undeniable proof that what is real, what is true, will always, in the end, find the sun. After seeing Clara build a real legacy from the soil while her family's empire crumbled, what does true success actually look like? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read and reply to every single one. But what happens when that betrayal comes not from parents, but from the one you trust most? In the next video, a wife's revenge is served cold after a devastating dinner confession. Subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss it, and like and share if you know what's coming.